Oh, it's okay. It's just
Coming in now.
Nice to meet you.
Good morning, I'm Richard. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Good morning, I'm Richard.
Good morning, Richard.
Nice to meet you.
Well, be seated, everybody. It's great to see you. We're Unit 1. I'm David Hardy, District Judge from Washoe County. I have to do a line Franny Forsman, who is the former federal public defender, and then Professor Jeffrey Stemple, who teaches at the University of, it's the Boyd School of Law here in Las Vegas, part of our Nevada University system.
Spoken like a true Northerner.
You remember, and then Rebecca Paddock, a distinguished graduate of UNLV School of Law. This is Unit 1, and we have selected the following questions. How would you distinguish between a government with a constitution and a constitutional government? Why is that distinction important? Why is a constitution considered a higher law? What are the major characteristics of a higher law? What are the advantages and disadvantages of a written constitution? When you may begin.
Philosopher Immanuel Kant said, the constitution of the state is eventually based on the morals of its citizens, which is based on the goodness of this constitution. This exemplifies the difference between a constitutional government and a government with a constitution. The constitution exemplifies higher law based on principles of fairness, morality, and justice.
A constitution is a recording of the principles on which a social contract is founded. The major distinction between a constitutional government and a government with a constitution is faithfulness to this doctrine.
A government with a constitution has the document, but does not necessarily abide by the principles contained within it. Article 14 of the Mexican Constitution states, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, possessions, or rights without a trial." However, through corruption, the Mexican government has found it hard to uphold these principles. There have been countless reports of human rights violations by the police and military, rising to an all-time high, according to Amnesty International.
In Sudan, the Constitution guarantees religious and ethnic freedom, yet it could not protect these rights and repeatedly violated them in the Darfur genocide. Such a state reflects what a government with a constitution is. By contrast, a constitutional government is organized so that it adheres to the will of the people. In American government, this is ensured through checks and balances, both between the branches of government and between federal and state authority.
Cases like Ex parte Maryland showcase these principles, with the court stating that if judicial powers were available to the military, then, as Chief Justice Robert Taney said, the people of the United States are no longer living under a government of laws, but every citizen holds life, liberty, and property at the will and pleasure of an army officer. Such instances affirm the United States remain a constitutional government and will not devolve merely into a government with a constitution.
A constitutional government upholds these fundamental principles like life, liberty, and rule of law, because a constitution is a reflection of higher law, or law based on fundamental principles of fairness, morality, and justice. As Cicero stated, true law is right and reason. It is of universal application, unchanging and everlasting. The United Nations used the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a definition of these fundamental guarantees when considering the admission of new countries. So a legitimate country must reflect higher law in its constitution.
In civil rights protests, Martin Luther King Jr. disobeyed laws, instead adhering to higher law, stating, "An individual who breaks a law that his conscience tells him is unjust is in reality expressing the very highest respect for law."
One principle of higher law is rule of law, the idea that nobody is above the law, reflecting a universal standard of fairness. In U.S. v. Nixon, the court held President Richard Nixon's use of presidential privilege to obstruct justice during the Watergate scandal unconstitutional, demonstrating not even the president is above the Constitution.
A written constitution can help guarantee legal accountability of the government through provisions such as Article 1, Section 8, which enumerates the powers so Congress can't overstep its boundaries. However, this leads to more rigidity of the law and attention to the specific language of the Constitution.
Article 2 of the Constitution is vague, leading to great argument over the implied powers of the president. The 15th Amendment guaranteed citizens the right to vote, but because of the rigidity of the language, it took almost 100 years to abolish Jim Crow laws in the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts.
Another disadvantage to the written constitution is that it lacks the flexibility of an unwritten constitution. Our constitution can only be changed by following the amendment process outlined in Article 5, under which only 27 amendments have been passed in the last 222 years.
Nevertheless, there are many advantages to a written constitution, since it is highly comprehensive and more accessible being compiled in one place. Because of this accessibility, citizens are more informed and can more easily participate in their government. Thank you. You're now ready for questions.
Thank you. I will first turn to my colleague, Ms. Fortson.
You've discussed quite a bit the advantages and disadvantages of a written or an unwritten constitution. I'm interested in your opinions, particularly in light of terrorist threats, with regard to your opinions with regard to whether or not there would be an advantage, particularly in responding to terrorist threats, if we didn't have a written constitution. How you feel about that?
Certainly, an unwritten constitution, should I say, is a lot more flexible, like that of the English system under parliamentary, because most of the things are through common law and through legislation, so they can merely be overturned by more legislation. Whereas with our constitution, we have to follow our amendment process or either take it up to the Supreme Court, which can take years to do so.
As you can see, with the Patriot Act is
Go ahead, you're fine.
okay. So, can you please repeat the question?
Well, I think you may have started, and I would follow through with that thought, because the Patriot Act is something that was designed to respond to terrorist threats. How might it be helpful to the Patriot Act if we had an unwritten constitution?
Well, it might help the Patriot. If we had an unwritten constitution, this would, as seen in many ancient governments, this would definitely take away power from anybody but the president. It would let him allow him to do anything he wants. And this could defend us against terrorism, but you can see that it could infringe upon individuals' rights because there are countless numbers of Islamic people living in the United States who've been tried unfairly for just the fact that because of their race and because of just the wrong intentions of government because of their fear of terrorism.
I think the Patriot Act would, if we had an unwritten constitution, it would really showcase Hobbes' ideal of a government. That is, that the government has a monopoly and total control over everything, including violence. So it can take executive actions much more quickly to protect the security of its citizens, but it does so at the expense of individual rights.
I would have to disagree and say that even though we have a written constitution, there are a lot of ways in which it can be stretched. Historically, Abraham Lincoln stretched the rules of the Constitution during the Civil War when he suspended the writ of habeas corpus. And more recently, President George Bush frequently used presidential signing statements to voice what he felt was the constitutionality of certain laws. And so even though the law is written, there's still a lot of debate about how it should be interpreted. So there's still room for presidents to stretch it in times of national emergency.
Do you like that?
I think it is necessary in a lot of cases because if you don't have that ability in the president, you have a weak government like we had during the Articles of Confederation. If you don't have a strong executive, you can't really respond with those threats.
You just vested in one person great discretion and authority, which takes me back to your comments about the rule of law and how the law predominates over the individual. Help me understand more that concept, rule of law, and when apparently there should be some exceptions.
Well, the rule of law derives from Cicero, or has its beginnings in classical republicanism, particularly Cicero, who expressed it strongly, when he stated that there is a natural law and that we should all sort of adhere to it. We are all held to an equal standard before it.
This is opposed to rule by man or rule by law, where one person creates the laws and is above the laws. This can be exemplified by Hobbes' conception of government, where the Leviathan creates the law and is ultimately above the law.
As President Coolidge said, laws are not made, they're discovered. And so this form of higher law is just the common understanding of what is the true form of law and what is right. And so you can see this in Brown versus Board of Education, where segregation was something that was accepted until the Supreme Court actually discovered that it wasn't something that they wanted within the government. And so it changed the entire culture and made higher law exist to the highest form that it could that we understood.
Let me see if we have another question.
The kind of the flip side of the control of, nobody being above the law is what is the role for public opinion? And the founders were very skeptical or even afraid of direct democracy. They preferred representative government. Do you agree or disagree? And I'm curious as to whether the ensuing 230 years have made the case for direct democracy weaker or stronger than it might have been in 1787.
I would agree with James Madison that there's a very large threat if you allow direct democracy, or just too much democracy in the hands of the people tends to corrupt. The Federalists tend to talk about the threat of factions who look after their own interests and don't really consider the needs of others or the common good. And I think you can see that today with protesters like the Occupy Wall Street protesters who, while some of them have very legitimate concerns about government, there's, in a lot of ways they start to devolve into a mob where they don't really have a well-defined goal and they're becoming rowdy.
A direct democracy doesn't allow for what Rousseau calls volontaire general, the general will to shine through. That is, it allows for mob rule to take place. And what Rousseau wanted to in the general will was that sort of what, not necessarily what the people wanted, but what was best for society to take place. With that being said, I think that the new forms of communication and technology, such as the internet and the media and television, have moved us not towards completely direct democracy, but more towards in those steps.
Benjamin Franklin defined direct democracy as almost two wolves and a lamb deciding what to have for dinner. Ultimately, we avoid this in our system, which is basically we almost move to, we have a representative democracy as far as that we elect people to represent our best interests, but they don't only respect our best interests, they look at the best interests of everybody in the whole country as a whole in a trustee theory government.
Can you provide an example? You did provide an arrow in Sudan as an example of a country that does not have a constitutional government. Can you provide another example of a country that does not have a constitutional government? And are there any benefits to not having a constitutional government?
A historical example of a country without a constitutional government that is actually very personal to me was Mexico during the 1968 Olympics, right before, when they held political protests. And the government was still operating under the Constitution of 1917, it still is. But a lot of protesters met at a square, and the Mexican government brutally murdered them, completely disregarding its political process and its constitution. So that showcases a government that has a constitution, but doesn't follow it.
More recently, in Vladimir Putin's last election, the voting rate was over 100%. I believe it was 140%. The census shows that the government fudged the statistics to make it look better. And I think when you have a government like that that disregards what its constitution is supposed to protect, that's an example of a government with a constitution.
Let me see if I can pin you down a little bit, because the question, I believe, is what is the advantage of an unwritten constitution? And earlier I had heard that a written constitution deprives us of flexibility. Tell me where it might be good that there is an unwritten, if at all, an unwritten constitution.
Well, an unwritten constitution works especially well in places like England, where they have lots and lots of years of history and common law and judicial precedents to build their law and their constitution off of. And they've evolved their society to work around this flexible constitution. Unfortunately, that doesn't work as well in all societies, because America only would have, right now, about 200 years of law and precedents to work off of. When we formed the country, we'd only have a few hundred, at the very most, if you're counting the colonial area. era. So it really, although it does lead to great flexibility of the system, it doesn't work for every country in every situation.
There are several countries in the Middle East without a constitution, and not having a constitution like Britain, they technically don't have a constitution, but they have written documents that make the law. But to actually not have a constitution at all totally disables the government. You can see there's one country in especially where they have reported that the police have taken bribes from people just to survive so that they don't get killed. And so this is because people will ultimately resolve to dysfunction if no one is ruling them, if no one is organizing them politically.
I think an example of what Alex talked about with an unwritten constitution, the United States to a certain extent has embraced this idea, both with the idea of judicial presidents, that they are sort of the highest law of the land until there's a constitutional amendment to override it. That has only happened in a few cases. And even when we declared independence, we knew that we didn't have, it would take us years to build up the case law and the constitutionality of these things. So when we affirmed ourselves independent, we sort of took a statute of reception where we received all the English common law, made it as our own, took the good parts of their system, and then used that to build our own system.
Well, that completes Unit 1 and our competition. Colleagues, is there anything you'd like to say?
You did an excellent job. This is a very tough unit. I don't like this unit at all. It's too academic, and, I want to
You
get
say that like it's a bad thing.
It's just, it's hard, but I thought you did an excellent job of demonstrating that you put some thought into this and that you had some feelings about it. Even though I think the subject matter is hard to get too, but I thought you did a really good job with that. You also did something that I tell almost every panel of students that I judge, and that is that you gave us an opportunity to see that you had done some discussion of some of these issues. You agree, disagree, you really done a wonderful job of examples. You were able to quickly pull up some examples of some of these various things, and you did a good job. So.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think maybe you could have added a little more, like on this last example, written, unwritten. The written constitution is at least a little more accessible, even if it has to be interpreted, right? How, even unless you're trained at the, even if you're trained at the Inns of Courts, I don't know how you figure out what's in the British Constitution, right? You have to pull together a lot of things and so on. So there's a more populist dimension to it. And there were a couple things where maybe you could marshal just a little more argument in favor of something, and but you supported each other well. Maybe you could have even done just a little bit more of that. That's the closest thing I can come to praises.
Well, the thing I want to say is you got stuck. I know you're not supposed to speak, but don't worry about getting stuck. Okay, when that happens, it's going to happen. And I thought your recovery was great. So don't go fretting about it.
I concur with the rest of my judges. I think you guys did a good job of speaking loudly and clearly and slowly so that we can really understand. Some of these issues are a little bit complicated and abstract, so it was nice to be able to really understand what you were saying. And again, as far as the stopping, it's better to stop and collect your thoughts than just start saying whatever. So it's a very good practice to have to not say anything instead of just say something just because you're so nervous about answering the question. So good job, everyone.
I liked your applications. They were historical, they were constitutional, and they were contemporary. I think this was a strong team with respect to your applications. Not only your prepared remarks, but you found a way to infuse them into your answers. It was something I noticed. We asked tough questions of you, which I think reveals our recognition of what you've prepared and how you studied for today. The mark of a good team, for me, is the team that I want to hear from beyond the time deadline. And there was something about your presentation that caused me to want to hear more. And that was good. I like the disagreements. In fact, I poked at one of you a little bit because I wanted to see if we could find some more disagreements. I think that can be healthy. I like how, I said this to one once before, let me try and say it briefly. This is a competition of substance. And the material, particularly Unit 1, is difficult. And some teams will compensate for the difficulty with trickery. They will use a lot of quotes. I remember a team from another state one time that was just very theatrical, dramatic in its presentation. And you want to show your passion, but not to the point where it becomes silly. And I thought you did a good job of just reining back so that you didn't cross the line. I felt your passion, but I didn't see the stuff that we've seen elsewhere sometimes. We want to see that you're conversant, that you're sincere, you're authentic, and I thought that was something that came through with this team. So it was a strong presentation. Congratulations.